Welcome back to the No Nonsense Sustainability Podcast. I'm Ildiko Simsic, and today we're discussing one of my favorite buzzwords, responsible employment. I have David Rousseau, Senior Consultant from Impactt Consulting with me. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Before we begin, let me remind you of the house rules. My friend Bob the Buzzer is here with us with his clone to keep us honest about the buzzwords and bring some clarity into how we're having these discussions. We are also prepared to disagree on a couple of things and ask some really tough questions where we might not have a yes or no answer. It's essential to have a sense of humor because we're discussing serious topics, but some of it is borderline ridiculous. So let's get going. David, if you had to explain what makes you proudest about your job, what would you say?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. It's about having a job where you have the opportunity to have a really direct and tangible impact.
What does that mean? I know that's the name of the company.
Yeah.
But maybe try and explain it in another word.
Doing something that I see as valuable because I have the chance to work and engage directly with workers in supply chains on issues that affect them. And I have a job that allows me to travel and feel like I can work with companies to make a real difference in the lives of vulnerable workers. And not a lot of jobs really allow you to do that at such a sort of direct level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, that is one of the most rewarding part of this job, right? Seeing how your actions and recommendations actually change things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be, I mean, it's a double-edged sword as well, because, you know, if you're going out on the ground to do an assessment or an investigation, yes, you have that opportunity to have a direct impact by identifying issues, but a lot of times you can be exposed to, you know, really difficult situations that workers find themselves in. Some people cope with that well, some people less well. So yeah, but you're really sort of get a window into what it's like for them on site and work with management to hopefully kind of address those issues if you're working with the right companies.
Yeah, so that leads us to our buzzer section. What is responsible employment?
So this is a tricky one without the buzzer going off, but if I can explain this in the most simple way possible, for me, responsible employment is everything to do with businesses' responsibility to treat workers in the right way and engage in practices that does not harm workers in their supply chain. So thinking about their responsibility to make sure that working conditions in their own operations or in their supply chain are at a high standard, that workers are being paid what they should be paid, that they have contracts in place, that there's not discrimination, exploitation, abuse. So that's just the idea fundamental to the UN guiding principles of, you know, as a business, you have responsibility for this. It's not just the responsibility of a government or a state. You have ownership of human rights, basically.
Okay, but human rights in the context of their labor management. So it's not every human right.
No.
It's the human rights related to freedom of association, so they can have a trade union. That representative is consulted. I like when you gave the tangible examples. And often we think that most of the labor laws are strong enough, but I think everyone would be surprised how many companies employ people without contracts, right?
Absolutely. In the US, that's not strictly speaking a requirement. And we always get that pushback from companies. It's the most common thing that we hear when we do an assessment or an audit, that they are compliant with local labor laws and that's all that matters. So the other issues that we point out, they try to push back against, because for them, they don't need to abide by those higher standards. They don't understand really that we're not just assessing against complying with the bare minimum, but actually with, you know, the higher standards that their companies say that they will follow.
And what are these higher standards? Are these determined by their internal policies that they commit themselves to, or is it some sort of an external pressure?
I think it's a combination of both. So if we're talking in this example about, I don't know, a garment factory in Bangladesh, right? They are usually committing to a code of conduct, a supplier code of conduct that their client, the brand, has asked them to sign.
I have to, supplier code of conduct.
Sure, yeah.
I know that it's in every sustainability report.
Yeah.
I know every company says our suppliers signed it, it must be good. But is there really a follow-up? Is there really an implementation of this? Are these employers really, or these companies really checking if the suppliers follow that code of conduct?
Well, a lot of times, no. And that's the basic, like, number one finding during assessment, because we're looking at not just the working conditions, right? But what are the policies of that site? What are the expectations that they are following? Like, do they have a policy on forced labor or human rights? And what we find is that oftentimes they have signed a supplier code of conduct, and all that means is basically just saying that they commit to certain expectations on human rights around, you know, excessive working hours, or around, you know, good health and safety standards, or being able to take annual leave, or their documents not being retained. But in practice, they've signed it, but they don't really understand, first of all, what the expectation actually is and how to translate that into practice, right? It's not enough to sign a document. You need to have not just the policies around that, because a policy is just a piece of paper. You can have a policy on not retaining, you know, workers' identity documents. That goes almost nowhere, right? Unless there's understanding of the relevant people internally, what that means, and then, okay, what's that process to implement it? How do you communicate that to workers? How do you put in place system, like, how do you ensure that that's not happening in practice? You know, what are the guidance what's the guidance that's being shared internally during, like, the visa process, to make sure that, you know, once a visa is processed, you know, you have a log to record that the worker is getting their document back. So there's so much more than just signing a blanket piece of paper or having a policy. It's about the policy, it's about the process, it's about the practice, and then it's also like the perception of, you know, do workers actually understand what this is for? Is it having the intended effect?
Yeah, my favorite project is when they had all these documents in a language that the local workforce didn't speak.
Yeah.
And they were like, yeah, we follow the policy. It's right there. We share it with them. It's just not in a language that's understandable to them.
Yeah, and that's usually where there's confusion when we conduct these types of assessments. Again, in this example with the supplier, they see labor rights, I guess, as a tick the box exercise. Yeah. So it's just, okay, we have signed the code of conduct. Yes, we have this policy, you know, done. You know, what are you going on about in terms of this issue? We have the policy in place. They don't really see it from the big sort of perspective of, like, the policy, the process, and then how it's implemented, and then how workers sort of understand that policy. And yeah, documentation not being in a worker's native language, whether it's the contracts or the training materials, the pay slip usually, the signs that are around the accommodation or the factory, or maybe it's only in one or two languages. That's something that we see a lot of, and we really try to work with, you know, the management of a factory or a supplier, for them to really understand what it really takes to implement these changes, right? It's not for us about coming to a site for 3 days, finding a bunch of issues, and then leaving. We really want the site to understand why the issue is an issue, what's driving the issue, and really concretely speaking, okay, what do you need to do to implement that change? Again, not just the policy, but what processes do you need to have in place so that you get to that end result?
And then it's a very unique set of skills, right? So when we talk about labor management, it's not necessarily equal to the HR people. Like in our world, the HR people, they know the local legislation, they do the administration of the contracts and the policies, but there's some nuances in this practical implementation of all of this that requires a different skill set almost, or a different set of expertise. Who do you think, obviously it's someone in HR, but who do you think is the best placed within a company to make these changes?
Yeah, absolutely. You need to have the right stakeholders involved.
Oh.
Stakeholder is a problem. You need to have the right people involved in the company that, you know.
Who are they?
Yeah, so the decision makers, you really need to set, the tone needs to come from the top. You know, if we're talking about, you know, a site or even a company, because we work with brands as well. It's not just, you know, factories or suppliers. For changes to be really implemented, you need to have that commitment from, you know, the CEO, the CFO, that really are, you know, telling the people internally, the managers within the company that, you know, this is the direction we want to go in. These issues matter to us, you know, working conditions matter to us. We need to do better, right? Because that's really the moment, that's where the momentum comes from, is from the top, and they have the decision makers at the top, at this sort of CEO level, they have the power to make sure that that message is understood and that then these changes are being implemented. But it's not just about, you know, the top senior level management of the company. You're right. The other key people within a company is definitely going to be human resources, because they are responsible for, you know, a big part of the worker's experience, right? They're helping, well, they're in control of the sort of processes to recruit a worker, to hire a worker. They're in charge of the disciplinary policy, to some extent, like the working hours. Also, payroll needs to play an important role in this. They need to, you know, do their job in making sure that workers are paid the correct amount, and also in a timely manner. There's not mistakes in the calculation of the payroll that we see a lot of, for example, for overtime hours. But there's also another, I think, internal team that's really important. It's health and safety, because everything to do with working conditions and the working environment, and, you know, maybe the hygienic condition of where workers are sleeping, or, you know, just the factory floor and sort of any health and safety risks there, they are responsible for that. And then I think what's important is the production people to also kind of understand what the company is trying to achieve when it wants to improve working conditions. Because a lot of these changes that you say you're going to implement around working hours, for example, or rest breaks, if that doesn't take into account the reality of that big business context and the production environment, it's never going to be implemented in practice, right? It's just words and big ideas. You can't just say, going forward, workers will only work a maximum of 72 hours per week, if there's something driving that overwork that's fundamental to how the business, you know, conducts its operations. So you really need to loop in those people to also find solutions. And that's where expertise internally at Impactt, with, you know, managers that have worked in a factory environment, for example, or lead auditors have worked in a factory environment, is really helpful, because we can give ideas on how to improve efficiency, maybe, and productivity without it being at the expense of the workers, or driving them to a situation where they're overworked. And we've done a lot of interesting work around that, actually, in China, and kind of having workshops with factory management on, okay, what are some of the ways that you can improve productivity without increasing working hours? It's not, easy, but it's a part of the puzzle, you know?
Okay. And then how do companies find impact? Because I know most of my experience has been that when they're trying to look into labor and human rights and supply chains, they would go to a big four and get the policies. Maybe it's even like some sort of a process, but it's largely documentation based. And then there's very little element of these site visits and actual assessments of operations overseas. I am wondering how these people find a company like yours and whether it's driven by sort of lender requirements or a push from shareholders, or it's a response to a scandal. Is there anything proactive where a company comes and says, we think we could do better, help us?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think there's a couple of scenarios. I think, especially maybe a couple of years ago, usually clients, big companies, brands would contact us for the first time when they're trying to put a fire out. So maybe there's an allegation of forced labor in a production facility.
That's
in
how we
Africa.
met. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. And you're right. That often is the case. It's driven by necessity, right? And by real time constraints to actually solve the issue. And then luckily we enjoy a reputation in the marketplace as a company that, goes beyond compliance or, tick the box like management systems exercises. We are the people that have the expertise and the boots on the ground to go on site and really understand what's happening, speak to workers, spend a lot of time understanding their experiences, the root cause of the issues, and then come up with a plan to really address them. So they come to us because they know that we can help address we can get the toughest stains out, basically. Yeah. We can address the hard to resolve situations. So that's just one sort of scenario though. And I would like to highlight that we're also selective in a lot of ways in terms of who we want to work with. And when we have companies that come to us, where, they're looking for us to act as a PR mouthpiece or to review their policies and procedures and like rubber stamp it, or maybe they're just looking for a traditional tick the box social audit. If we don't see the impact to workers, or if we don't think that company is really trying to drive meaningful change, there's really a misalignment and a disconnect, and it's not in our interest or that company's interest to enter into a partnership. So we like to continue working with companies. Maybe they do come to us originally to put out a fire, that actually have people within the company who care about what they're doing, who generally are trying to make changes through their role. Usually they're maybe part of a social sustainability team. It really depends on the company, but people within the company that want to drive change, and then who come back to us to continue making those improvements. We don't really like to do just a one-off engagement. Like, as much as possible, we don't just want to do one assessment or one audit. That's very reactionary, and it's also difficult for us when, a client's coming to us and they needed boots on the ground yesterday. You really need to look at it from a bigger picture and yes, do the assessment, but after that, work with the company to think about, okay, what was it about this situation that led it to happen? What needs to change in terms of the way that you work with your suppliers, the way that you work with your subcontractors? What can we do to improve the situation? So now 70% of all of our business comes from existing clients that, are using us to improve their bigger strategy on, and I'm going to use, and maybe I should buzz myself, human rights due diligence. Right? Which is just the process for identifying and addressing and preventing risks related to labor rights in their supply chains or their operations.
But are they using it to actually better themselves? Or is it just a way to get another sticker or fulfill some criteria for investors?
It can be that, and I'm not gonna lie and say that that never happens, but we have the power also to shape the approach of a project, and we always internally we have a kind of go no go process, right? So if a company is coming to us and saying they want to conduct an audit just for the sake of it, or without really any intention to really address the issues or understand what's going on, we may not want to do that, or we will push them to do a bit more than that if we can. So our best clients, the ones that we have the longest term relationships with, are the ones that, we've managed to work with on a deeper level. And I think naturally over time, we kind of filter out the ones that don't have the right intentions. And of course, a lot of companies look at this human rights due diligence as just a compliance exercise. You're absolutely right. But usually they know that we're not quite the right fit for what they're looking for because of
somewhere else, right?
Yeah, because also for them, it's always about also cost, and they can go to somewhere else, another consultancy where maybe they'll get an audit or an assessment for at a lower cost, and they typically, like you said, tend to go for a Big Four consultancy because they know that the Big Four consultancy is gonna, give them what they need, maybe more with the management systems focus, though that's something we do.
You're not cutting costs there, no?
Yeah, well, with the audits and the assessments, that would be an area where sometimes even big corporations can be quite cost sensitive. If it's like a big revamp of their management systems, of course, they're expecting to spend more, but where we get a lot of pushback is like this kind of embedded notion that an audit is something very, very simple, very cost effective. You're in and you're out. And that's where we have to work with clients to show them, it's actually, maybe that's what you've gone with in the past, sure, but we're talking about something that's actually more in depth in order for it to be valuable.
And there's one thing I want to go back to. You said sometimes these companies are more upfront about doing these human rights, labor, social assessments because they're pressured, but they don't really care. Is it true? Are they really this honest about not really caring?
They would never phrase it that way.
So what's the phrase? What's the buzzword for that?
Well, I'll give you a very real example and this doesn't mean that these companies don't always want to change, but in the United States, there's this law called the U.S. Tariff Act, that's from a long time ago, from 1930, but it's been used increasingly, especially by Donald Trump, to block imports into the United States for companies where there are allegations of forced labor in their supply chains. So those companies that no longer can export to the United States because of some allegation are often in a horrible position financially if the United States is one of their biggest export markets. And that's a real financial pressure on them to sort out the situation. Maybe they wouldn't have wanted or cared to sort it out otherwise, but they have no choice because they're hemorrhaging money and they need to show evidence to U.S. Customs and Border Protection that they are addressing the issues, right? They need proof that they've addressed the issues. So they come to us in these situations to sort out the issue. And then we take them on a journey where, maybe initially they wouldn't have come to us in the first place if it weren't for this situation, but we take them on a journey where we hopefully get to a place where they actually understand and recognize why these issues are a problem and why it's in their interest as a business to do the right thing, but also to, kind of streamline the way that they work with their suppliers. Sometimes it actually has business benefits as well to take a really close look at your operations and supply chains and improve the working conditions. And we try to help them see the light through that process. So that's a major pressure point, I would say. Lender requirements, for example, in solar supply chains, for example, that could be another big driver. Allegations in the media could be another big driver. So yeah, there's a lot of there's different pressure points for sure. Sometimes companies, that have a really strong process in place, a strong program in place around human rights due diligence, they will always complement.
But what does that mean? What is part of this human rights due diligence that they do? Like in practical terms, because, like we talked a lot about practical examples of what companies are doing, how, they're dealing with third-party workers, how, with the gig economy, one worker works for many companies, and then who's responsible for what aspects of their labor contract. So when you talk about human rights due diligence of a company, what does it actually mean on like an ongoing basis?
Sure. So I have a really tangible example for you, a really concrete one on this. So what I mean in this context is them taking steps to identify risks in their supply chain by doing internal audits or contracting a third party like us to do an assessment. A couple years ago, a big global food and beverage company contacted Impactt to do an assessment of their transportation supply chain in South America. So they have lots and lots of warehouse and distribution centers where they hire out or outsource transportation companies that will bring in truck drivers to bring in those products to, the marketplace, basically to the stores in that city or that area. And they were concerned about the working conditions of those truck drivers because they weren't employed directly by the company and it was all outsourced, right? And they didn't have a lot of control over that. They really didn't know who these truck drivers were.
I mean, I know companies who do outsource, and you have your master service agreement with the agency or this third-party employer, and you can put things in there to make sure that people have the correct working hours, overtime payment, health and safety, rest period. Is it really true that there are companies who have no control whatsoever on what happens to these third-party workers?
Well, if they have no control, that's the problem that we're trying to solve, because it doesn't have to be that way. And that situation it's a major blind spot for a company like that to not have visibility into who is actually driving these trucks in their supply chain. Do they have contracts in place? What are their working conditions like? Are they being paid? Do they have social security? Can they take rest breaks? It's a problem that they need to address. And actually, going back to your earlier point, the reason that this company contacted us was because in Brazil, at one of another company's warehouse, the local authorities basically conducted a raid on truck drivers that were living in caravans on at a warehouse who were working in appalling conditions, right? Who had no contracts, no direct employment relationship with the company or with anyone for that matter. Didn't have any accommodation, were just living on site, being paid in cash, being underpaid, not being paid overtime. So it's just an extreme example of, what happens when, as a company, you don't take that responsibility to have a bit more control, because it's an easy excuse for a lot of companies that, they do use when they say, these workers are not our direct workers. They are the responsibility of our supplier or someone else. We can't do anything about this situation, or we're not legally liable to do anything about this situation. That's something that you tend to get as an argument sometimes when you're dealing with subcontracted workers or workers in a facility, like cleaning or security staff. There's this reluctance of the client, so the brand basically that is subcontracting out those services, to want to take action to make sure there's proper and good working conditions for those workers. There's often a buzzword that comes up, which is co-employment risk is something that you will hear companies say a lot when you talk to them about making changes to improve the conditions of their subcontracted workers. So let's say the security guards at a brewery, right? For a company, they will say, companies might say, and there's a lot of buzzwords in this, if we were to provide grievance mechanisms to these workers, or training on human rights to these workers, or if we were to audit the subcontractor, there's a risk of co-employment. And by that, they mean there's an implication that they are seen as the employer of those workers, which can get them into trouble legally. I'm not a legal expert, but I would contest that logic.
But then the question I have on my mind is it a systemic issue of how, with the gig economy and outsourcing, we're moving away from traditional employee-employer relationship and employee status to more like outsourced and contracted workforce? And if that's true, is this new corporate sustainability, like the omnibus in the EU, is that addressing it adequately? Because before, we had clients who did the exact same thing. They had a problematic department where working conditions were always tricky, where there was always a risk of subcontractors not meeting, basic labor requirements. So what they did is they cut this department from their workforce and they just put it in their supply chain. But now there's more push to have visibility on all of these issues. And I'm wondering how that's changing the approach of companies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'd say to your first point, it is a trend that we've seen in the past years, but really decades, that just goes back to globalization and companies, outsourcing like non-core activities, like, a company outsourcing warehouses or facility management, or maybe a part of their production line to reduce costs, right? And that's something that we've seen increasingly over the past decades. And there's also, a need for company to have more flexible working arrangements, right? I don't like, there's this
working from home?
No, I mean like, sort of flexibility in basically only using workers when they need workers, and saving costs by not having a permanent workforce. For example, in warehouse and logistics, it's very common that such a company would only bring in workers at the warehouse when they need them, when there's a lot of product that needs to be moved out of the warehouse. For them, it doesn't make sense to have all of these workers on a payroll, right? Because they need to have a lot of flexibility in like meeting their customers' demand. And that's also a trend that you see across sectors. So there's like a lot of business drivers to this. COVID might have accelerated that because people, as you said, were working from home and, trying to find, more informal work because they had difficulties finding a job. I think that the response to that from like regulations and legislation is, I think, definitely partially incomplete. So you've seen some successes in different countries, right? In the UK,
the 0-hour contracts, is it the same?
Yeah.
That you block a worker basically, but you only pay them when you use them, and you're not required to give them hours.
Yeah, exactly. There's the 0 hour contracts, and then at least the one good example would be, court cases recently, like with Uber drivers, but that have had mixed success. Uber drivers now are recognized as employees as of a couple of years ago in the UK. Deliveroo drivers are not, and sometimes the basis for whether a company has a formal employment relationship with a gig economy worker is based on some pretty abstract concepts, like, can that worker be replaced by someone else? Can they turn down the assignment? Can they be fired by the company? There's some parameters, but there's a lot of ambiguity. And actually, it makes me think of just a recent assessment that we did literally the other day, where we found that some cleaners at a factory were being paid under the minimum wage. And when we presented this finding to the site, they said, now wait a minute, they're under a service agreement because they were retired and then we brought them back, and they have this flexible working arrangement where they're not actually an employee, so we don't have to pay them minimum wage. And then just to point that there's a lot of gray area, right? So we looked at the laws in that particular country on whether that was accurate or not. And, a lot of times it's not very clear cut. According to international, like, in our view, the right thing to do would be to consider these workers employees and give them the same rights and benefits. But sometimes there's not a clear cut case if you look at the national legislation. And then I think at the EU level, there's this EU platform directive that is looking at having a bit more guidance for EU member states on, the formalization or making, the workers, like sort of platform workers, more recognized as employees. That's in progress. But with the EU Sustainability Directive, the whole idea initially was that companies would be obligated to look beyond the first tier of their supply chain and actually look at where the risks are.
Everything.
Right. Based on the risk, not about how close you are to that worker. So it's very much a risk-based approach, which would have driven companies to think about risks in transportation, for example, or whatever part of their supply chain where there's really high amount of risk because you have informal workers. But now, there have been changes to that legislation with Omnibus, and now companies, there's obviously a new threshold for the scope and it's delayed, but also companies now just need to look at that first tier, which is a shame because there's less of that driver now, maybe to actually look at these pockets of risks related to these workers that we're talking about that are subcontracted or maybe have more informal working arrangements.
And that's kind of going backwards. Like, I remember 10, 15 years ago having these exact same conversations in the context of the international financial institution, like development bank context, where we had the policy and it looked at the first tier of supply chain. And we tried to encourage our clients to look at the subcontractors because that's where the issues are. But we were, in general, unsuccessful. So this, like, walking back is really not helping to move the industry forward and to provide companies, even with just tangible guidance on what's is expected of them. I know Impactt recently published a publication on responsible recruitment. It's buzzword-worthy. So if anyone is listening who's running a company or a department that thinks like, okay, maybe we could do better, what are some of the very pragmatic aspects to look at if they want to recruit in a responsible way?
Yeah, I think with recruitment, I think the the problem, right? If we start there, is that, for example, if we take the example of fishing or tuna, we're talking about very large and complex supply chains. So you have, retailers in the UK, supermarkets that are selling seafood, and they go through an importer, and then maybe the importer is going to a processing site that's getting the fish from the local market. And in that processing site, which is very sort of labor intensive, you have many migrant workers, let's say in the Maldives or the Seychelles or in Thailand even. And those migrant workers are recruited from home countries in Bangladesh or in India. And these workers are often coming from maybe like sort of vulnerable groups, where they're coming from a village outside the capital.
What's a vulnerable group?
By that, I mean that they are in real need for work and are more willing to accept conditions that might not be acceptable to most people, because they really don't have another choice, because they come from a remote village where there's not a lot of work opportunities. Maybe they didn't have the chance to have an education. It's hard to get a job, and they need to support not just themselves, but all of their families. So there's a real pressure on them to go out and find work. And the best way to do that is for them to migrate abroad, where they can earn much more money than in their home country. But doing that involves a number of different steps. It's not just as simple for them to apply to a job online and great, a couple weeks later, they're on a plane and
they're in the Seychelles and
in a great accommodation, with great benefits, great salary, that's part of the problem. They are not clear on the expectations of the job, because that's not clearly communicated to them by their employer or by the recruitment agency throughout the process. But we're actually getting ahead of ourselves, because the real issue is that before they can actually get that job in the first place, they need to go through several intermediaries, right? Example of Nepal, you're a person living in a remote villages far away from Kathmandu. You want a job. The first step is maybe you're told about a job opportunity by someone in your village or an uncle or a relative, and that person then brings you to the next closest town so that you can meet a recruitment agency or a sub agency that will connect you with the people that can get you the job. But to finally get to that place where you're in an interview process and getting the job, you have to pay money, a lot of money, at each step of that process, even though you yourself don't have a lot of money, your family doesn't have a lot of money, and the whole reason you're migrating is because you need to support your family. So you have to borrow money from loan sharks at a high interest. Maybe you need to borrow money from your family or someone else, or you need to put down your house or your land as collateral, or your family's house as collateral. So you're put in a situation where before you're even starting your job, you've had to spend a lot of money, potentially thousands of US dollars, before you even start to work. And that puts you in a very, very difficult position in terms of, being able to reimburse the money that you had to spend, but also if your reality of your job doesn't live up to what you were told, and you're not enjoying your job and you're not getting paid enough or what you were told, and your job is really risky, and you're working in a processing facility 7 days a week, you can't get out of that situation because you need to stay there to pay the money back. So then you're trapped in this cycle of what we call debt bondage. And yes, that is a technical term, but it's exactly what that means. You're trapped because you owe money and you need to stay in the situation that you're at, even if you're being exploited, because you need the money so badly, right?
Okay, so let's say I'm the company in Kathmandu and I'm looking for workers. Is that really my responsibility? Should I go out to the villages and find these people? Because I'm pretty sure this is what you hear all the time, right? What can a company like that do so that the workers can cut through the intermediaries and go straight to the company?
Yeah, I think there's a number of positive examples, including in Nepal, of that actually, working in practice. So what we're talking about here is trying to reduce the number of middlemen and intermediaries between the worker and the employer that's giving them the job in, let's say, Thailand, right? Let's maybe take Thailand as an example. So as a let's say as a processing company in Thailand, what can you do about the situation, right? That's the question.
Yeah. Am I going to the Nepalese villages?
So you're right. You going to the Nepalese villages, if as a Thai HR staff from a processing facility, might not be practical or realistic, but there are things that you can do and that are within your control. First of all, you need to find a good agency to work with. It's true that hiring direct, if you have no contacts in that country, let's say Myanmar, is going to be very difficult. You're not going to be able to have workers come directly from Myanmar to your processing facility in Thailand. I mean, there are examples of that working for very large companies that have a lot of resources and a lot of manpower to address that sort of challenge. But the reality is you don't know anything about like how the visa processing works. You don't know the language. You don't know where to find the candidates, how to get them from point A to point B. You need one intermediary at least most of the time, but you need to find the right partner who, to the largest extent possible, can be trusted. Well, that's a big word, but is at least set up in a way that they can recruit those workers without those workers having to pay money. So what we've done in the past and what we would always recommend is for that processing facility to have an open tender process, right? To first off, I guess before the open tender, they need to have, the criteria of what are they looking for in a responsible recruitment agency, a recruitment agency that is, I guess, less likely to take money from workers in that process, right? So you need to look for, and it's not just about that agency. The processing site has a lot of responsibilities in making sure that doesn't happen, but we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, the step is then having a clear list of criteria. Okay. Having, proper business registration, having a certain amount of staff and HR, to know that it's like a professional setup, to have certain policies and processes like in place around recruitment. So like they have good, like solid management systems, and also understanding like how they work, how their recruitment works. Like, do they go direct to the village to find candidates, to do like recruitment days and drives? Do they bring them to, the local town or the city and have like a big event where they talk about the jobs that are available? Or do they use intermediaries, right? Because if you have selection criteria that says, you should be recruiting workers directly, or if you're using intermediaries, you need to disclose them and really have a lot of information about them. You can already have a bit more control, like, as the processing site, how the recruitment agency is recruiting its workers and how it's set up internally. So you start to have some level of assurance that you're not just working with any random recruitment agency that's giving you the best possible price. And the other thing that I'm getting to is around the price, because doing things right in this context does cost money, right? For the agency to be able to go directly to the village level and to have staff that are trained on, proper recruitment practices, for them to like monitor their own recruitment to make sure workers are not paying fees, and to not want to take money from workers, they need to be paid the right amount. So you actually need to understand what is the actual cost of that recruitment process from beginning to end. As a processing site, you need to go through that exercise and really understand what does it actually cost the recruitment agency. You maybe need to do some benchmarking or analysis or desktop research. And then what do you need to pay them on top of that so that they can have a margin and be profitable as a business and not want to take money from workers. And then after that, you need to have a good contract in place with that agency that outlines your expectations. You ensure that they're being paid the right amount, and then you monitor them to make sure that everything is happening as it should, right? A grievance mechanism, maybe you work with a local expert in country that calls the workers before they leave. You go there yourself as the processing site to see how the recruitment is happening on the ground, and so on and so forth. It's possible. It's entirely possible. We've seen it all the time.
I think that's a very good conclusion, a very good advice for companies in this position. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for being here with me today and discussing responsible employment and responsible recruitment. I particularly like the practical examples.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.